Hello, I'm Dr. Nina Luning-Prack, professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and chair of the Autoimmune Association's Medical and Scientific Advisory Committee. I'm delighted to be with you today and to introduce the speakers for today's session. We have a terrific lineup of experts to share their findings and insights with everyone. First, let's hear from Dr. Tamiko Katsumoto, a rheumatologist and a clinical associate professor in the Division of Immunology and Rheumatology at Stanford University. Dr. Katsumoto is passionate about human health, the environment, and education of care providers and patients alike, teaching them about the merits of sustainable plant-rich diets as a strategy both to improve individual health and to mitigate climate change. She is a member of React Room and will be sharing her insights into the relationship between diet, autoimmune disease, and how it impacts climate change. Dr. Katsumoto, if you please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for this kind invitation to speak at your virtual summit today. My name is Tamiko Katsumoto. I'm on faculty in rheumatology at Stanford University. And today it's my honor to speak to you about sustainable anti-inflammatory diets for autoimmune disease and planetary health. Next slide. Here are my disclosures. Next. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to frame this presentation in the context of questions. Let's start out by talking about how food can drive inflammation, which is especially of concern for patients with autoimmune disease. Then we'll talk about what an anti-inflammatory diet is, and I'll try to convince you of why we should try to eat this way. And finally, the final question is something I'm extremely passionate about, which is the relationship between diet and planetary health. Next slide. I'm excited to share with you a recent study done by our Dutch colleagues looking at patients with arthritis. This was called the Plants for Joints study. This was a randomized controlled trial where they randomized half of the participants to a whole food plant-based diet along with lifestyle modifications compared to control. And as you can see on the left, the rheumatoid arthritis patients who were in the Plants for Joints group showed a highly significant improvement in their arthritis over the course of the study. And this effect was even more pronounced in the seronegative group. Sorry, the build didn't quite work here. These results are impressive and are consistent with what I've seen in my patients who changed their diets to more plant-based eating patterns. On the right, they tested osteoarthritis, the most common form of arthritis. We have very few effective treatments for OA, so this result was indeed quite striking and highly significant. Plant-based diets can be extremely powerful, and this study really demonstrates that food can be medicine. Next slide. So poor diet is the #1 driver of so many chronic diseases here in the United States. Here's a picture of a lot of familiar foods: pizza, hamburgers, fried foods. These are the things that make up our standard American diet, which we are going to refer to as SAD. Our diets are extremely high in ultra-processed foods, high in animal products, and therefore considered highly inflammatory and can drive a lot of disease states. Next. Next slide. We are learning more and more about systemic chronic inflammation, or SCI, which can lead to a multitude of chronic diseases, as shown here. These include cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, cancer, and even depression, and most importantly, autoimmune disease. There are a number of drivers that you can see of chronic systemic inflammation, but the biggest driver of all is something we have control over, and that is diet. Next slide. Ultra-processed foods can drive inflammation through our gut microbiome. A rule of thumb is that if a food has a bunch of different chemicals and additives in them, things you wouldn't normally find in your own kitchen, this likely represents an ultra-processed food you should try to limit. We've been hearing headlines about how ultra-processed foods are linked to higher mortality, and we're just now better starting to understand the biology of what makes ultra-processed foods so problematic. Here's a schematic of a happy, healthy gut microbiome on the far left with a great diversity of bacteria that helps to maintain a tight epithelial barrier with a healthy mucus lining, as shown here. It turns out that several of the chemicals in ultra-processed foods, like emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, food colors, nanoparticles, as seen on the top. These can upset the microbiome and incite inflammatory reactions that can cause the gut epithelium to become leaky. The idea is that a leaky gut can allow toxins and bacteria to leak into the body, and this can drive chronic inflammation, including various autoimmune diseases, and this has been associated with poor health. Hence, this highlights the importance of our food choices in maintaining a healthy and robust gut barrier that combats inflammation. Next slide. Okay, so what is an anti-inflammatory diet and why should we eat this way? Next. Diet is an extremely personalized thing, and it turns out there's no one-size-fits-all approach. That being said, there are several examples of diets that can be more anti-inflammatory. And here I'll show you some suggestions from Dr. Andrew Weil, who is one of the founders of integrative medicine. The base of the pyramid is, of course, your healthy vegetables and fruits, which should be consumed generously. Then there are whole grains, not refined, and beans and legumes, which are a key source of protein and fiber. Healthy fats include olive oil, nuts, and seeds. Fish and seafood can be consumed in moderation, and I would suggest always looking at seafoodwatch.org to find out which choices are considered safe and sustainable. Soybeans and tofu can be consumed 1 to 2 times a day. Other proteins, such as eggs and cheese, should be limited to 1 to 2 times a week. Healthy herbs and spices can be unlimited. 2 to 4 cups of tea per day, supplements daily. And finally, healthy sweets and red wine should be consumed sparingly. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about the blue zones. This is an outstanding book and Netflix series by Dan Buettner, where he studied 5 regions in the world that have the highest concentration of centenarians, people that live to be over 100 years old. And one thing that he noted is that the diets of these 5 blue zones are anti-inflammatory, and it turns out they are 95 to 100% plant-based. The reason this information is so important is that you'll never be able to run a diet study for 100 years. In fact, most diet studies do not have significant long-term follow-up. So the Blue Zones diet is a key dietary pattern that holds a lot of credibility. Next slide. Here is the data from a large Adventist cohort of over 60,000 participants, where they looked at how dietary pattern affected body mass index and prevalence of type 2 diabetes. And what you can see quite nicely is that there is a clear trend of decreased body mass index as you go from the non-vegetarian red bar to the more vegetarian, and finally on the far right, the blue vegan eating pattern. Similarly, we see a decreasing prevalence of type 2 diabetes as dietary patterns become more and more plant-based. Next slide. There are numerous well-documented benefits of whole food, and by whole food, I mean not ultra-processed food, whole food plant-based diets. Decreases in all-cause mortality, weight loss, decreased risk, even reversal of cardiovascular disease, decreased risk of several cancers, decreased risk of diabetes, even improved migraines. You Are What You Eat is the vegan twin study done by my dear friend, Dr. Christopher Gardner, as featured on Netflix, which showed the benefits of the vegan diet. And there were even signals that aging might be slowed with the vegan diet. There are numerous other health benefits of whole food plant-based diets, with more and more studies coming out regularly, including many that show improvement in several autoimmune diseases with whole food plant-based diets. Next slide. I want to take a moment to celebrate fiber. Note that fiber is only found in plants and not animal products. Here are some examples of the amount of fiber found in several different foods. We should be aiming to eat at least 28 to 35 grams of fiber per day or more. So if you ate about 5 of these different foods, you'd be in the right ballpark. Currently, unfortunately, most Americans are highly deficient in fiber, and they eat an average of 15 grams of fiber a day or less. In terms of fiber's many benefits, fiber can increase the feeling of fullness, so you tend not to overeat. In addition, fiber can increase metabolic rate. It can promote loss of calories in stool, such that weight loss is promoted. Fiber helps to promote a beneficial gut microbiome. It leads to the production of these short chain fatty acids that are important for maintaining that gut epithelial barrier integrity and immune homeostasis. And finally, fiber can improve the glycemic response to food and can reduce the risk for heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. Next slide. A question I get asked by my patients a lot is, well, how am I going to get enough protein from plants? Here, you can see a variety of plant source proteins as compared to animal proteins below. The average individual needs about zero point 0.8 grams per kilo of protein. So for a 150-pound sedentary person, this equates to about 54 grams of protein a day, which can be easily achieved by eating a variety of plant foods seen on top. And in contrast to animal source proteins, plants contain many healthful phytonutrients and antioxidants. They contain fiber, and importantly, they contain no cholesterol. Next slide. So, some of the foods, one issue that we struggle with in the United States is we overconsume refined grains. By that, I mean things like white bread, white pasta, white rice. Instead, we should aim to consume more whole grains, like shown here. It's also worth becoming familiar with foods like chia seeds, flax seeds, hemp seeds. These are foods that are high in omega-3 fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatory, and also high in protein and fiber. In general, if we were to eat a mostly plant-based diet, we should supplement with vitamin B12. In addition, all of us, regardless of our dietary pattern, have a high likelihood of being vitamin D deficient, so we should consider supplementing with vitamin D. We should make sure we're consuming enough iron, zinc, calcium, and omega-3 fatty acids. So simply taking a multivitamin is an easy safeguard against the possibility of becoming deficient. Next slide. We can all learn from Michael Pollan's words of wisdom, which is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Next slide. So now we're going to switch gears a bit and try to answer the question, what does diet have to do with planetary health? Next slide. Dr. Ventura just gave a wonderful talk about our climate crisis, and I want to introduce you to a fantastic educational website on climate change called Project Drawdown, based on the book by Paul Hawken. When we look at this pie chart showing all global sources of emission, what is most striking is that food, agriculture, and land use represents about a quarter of our carbon footprint, predominantly driven by the greenhouse gas methane. Emissions from food are right up there with electricity production, which is huge. And it turns out the vast majority of our food emissions are related to animal agriculture. Next slide. Next slide. Animal agriculture currently exploits 45% of Earth's ice-free land surface and accounts for more than 80% of humanity's total land footprint. Very sobering. Next slide. The footprint of animal agriculture continues to expand, accounting for more than 90% of Amazon deforestation. This is the secondhand smoke from your steak. Next slide. So how much would going plant-based help the environment? Here is a helpful graph showing the greenhouse gas footprint of various diets. And what is notable here is that if you were to go vegan 2/3 of the time, you would cut your food-related emissions by 60%. Going vegan 100% of the time would result in a dramatic 85% reduction in one's greenhouse gas footprint from food. Next slide. Coming back to my favorite, Project Drawdown, they rank ordered the list of high impact climate actions for households and individuals. And guess which two came out on top? Reducing food waste and plant-rich diets. I just want to also make a quick plug for reducing food waste and emphasizing the importance of composting to minimize the methane emissions caused by food in our landfills. Next slide. I frequently get asked the question about plant-based meats, and here are the relative carbon impacts from various meats versus plant-based meats. Beef and lamb have an enormous carbon footprint, not only due to the methane they emit, but also from the land that is needed for grazing, which is therefore not being reforested, or the land that is needed to grow the soy and the corn that is used to feed the animals. You can see that plant-based meats, such as from Impossible or Beyond Meat, have a 36-fold lower carbon footprint as compared to beef. So, If you're craving a burger, consider choosing a plant-based burger. Next slide. I want to end with an inspirational quote from Jonathan Safran Foer's book called We Are the Weather. He says, quote, "Changing how we eat will not be enough on its own to save the planet. However, we cannot save the planet without changing how we eat." Next slide. So in conclusion, I hope that I've convinced you of the merits of eating a more sustainable, anti-inflammatory, whole food, plant-based diet, in that this will reduce the development and severity of many chronic inflammatory diseases, including autoimmune diseases. And perhaps just as importantly, this dietary pattern is better for planetary health. We are all empowered to vote with our forks every single day. So let's vote to improve our health and the health of our planet. Next slide. I want to thank you all for your kind attention. I want to acknowledge my patients, Dr. Yasmin Ventura, Olivia Casey, our React Room team. Visit our website at reactroom.org. Christopher Gardner, Pat Brown, my friends, family, and colleagues who've supported me. And importantly, I want to thank all of you for listening today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Katsumoto. Next up will be Dr. Yasmin Ventura, who is a rheumatologist at the University of Chicago, specializing in inflammatory myopathies and interstitial lung disease. She is also the director of the University of Chicago Myositis Center and the project lead on a just-released survey that will assess the impact of climate change on autoimmune patients across the country. Also, as a member of React Room, Rheumatology Engaged in Action for Climate Health, Dr. Ventura is passionate about drawing attention to climate change and its impacts on autoimmune disease. Welcome, Dr. Ventura.
Hi, my name is Yasmin Ventura. I'm a rheumatologist, and it is really my big pleasure to be here with you all at the Autoimmune Association Virtual Summit of 2024. So my topic today is a hot topic in autoimmune diseases, and it is titled A Warming Planet. And I'm joining my colleague, Tomiko Katsumoto, on this very important topic that we want to discuss with you today. So I want to start by saying a few things that have been noticed in the last several years. So the NIH has identified that the frequency of these antibodies called ANAs, or anti-nuclear antibodies, which are proteins that self-identifying that identify self-proteins, have been on the rise since at least the late 1980s. So ANAs, because again, they target proteins in our own bodies, they are considered to be a sign of autoimmunity. And they have steadily increased since they started recording this data in 1988. And as you can see here, they have increased in males and females. They have increased in mostly in all races and ethnicities. And they have also increased more steeply among young individuals here between 12 and 19 years old. Nowadays, we expect that at least 42 million people in the United States have a positive ANA, again, which is a blood test that we commonly use to identify patients who have specific autoimmune diseases. Not only there are signs of an increasing autoimmunity in the blood of many individuals in the United States, but we have also identified that the frequency and diagnosis of autoimmune diseases, which is when we have autoimmunity, again, evidence of autoantibodies such as the ANAs that I mentioned to you, but also signs and symptoms consistent with an actual disease have also been on the rise. And there have been the rise in the last several decades as well. And we are talking about all kinds of autoimmune diseases, from type 1 diabetes to rare types of autoimmune diseases such as systemic sclerosis and Sjogren's disease. Nowadays, we expect that that from this data, the increase in incidence, new diagnoses of autoimmune diseases have increased every year by about 3.7%. And the prevalence, the amount of patients who deal with autoimmune diseases at any given time, has increased to 7.1% on a yearly basis. So again, this data that is being collected for quite some time is not only here in the United States, but in Europe as well, in Asia, and in South America, and has been noticed as well anecdotally in our practices. So many of our patients and colleagues and family members have noticed that this diagnosis of autoimmune diseases have become more prevalent among their friends and family members. So, what exactly happens? Again, this is a common question we have in the clinical setting. Why one develop autoimmune diseases? And the truth of the matter is that we don't really know the exact factors that cause an autoimmune disease. But the paradigm, our theory, is that autoimmune diseases result from these very complex interactions of several genetic mutations. It's not usually one genetic mutation, but a combination of many genetic mutations in interaction with environmental factors. Environmental factors related to our lifestyle, to our ecosystem where we live and work, to our social determinants of health, our socioeconomic status, and also our social relationships, and also our exposure to chemical and physical hazards in our environment. So we believe that these interactions, again, they're very difficult to evaluate and measure in conjunction with our genetic background, is the one that leads ultimately to the diagnosis of an autoimmune disease. And why is that again, we are seeing an increase in the number of these diseases over time? And the truth is that we believe that those changes, that increasing numbers of autoimmune diseases, are happening too fast for them to be secondary to the evolution, to the changes in our genetic risk factors. As we know, again, the evolution of our genes is something that doesn't happen in a matter of few years or even decades. It's usually something that takes a long time to actually happen. And they are unlikely to be the cause for this increase in autoimmune diseases we are seeing in our practices. And also, genetic studies, even after, again, the genetic revolution in the beginning of the 21st century, have noticed that genetic risk factors play lesser of a role than we initially imagined. So even when we compare and we study twins, identical twins for autoimmune diseases, it is, and normally we find that these twins, they share the same kind of autoimmune diseases for no more than 30 or even 40% of time. So again, there is a big gap, and even for folks who are genetically identical, meaning that genetic risk factors probably, again, explain less than we thought they had explained in the past. And one needs to believe that, again, what is changing the paradigm that is causing an autoimmune disease is likely to be the changes in our environmental exposure. And those changes, environmental exposures and daily life habits, are the ones that are very rapidly evolving, and they have been more intensified in the last several decades. And again, we can all relate to that. Even in a generation, we have seen great changes in the diets. Again, what we eat nowadays is very different to what our grandparents used to eat. Our microbiome has changed. We have never been exposed to so many chemical pollutants. We have been exposed to different infections than we had in the last few decades. And again, COVID-19 is just an example of these changes. We have never been as sedentary, as obese, as sleep deprived, as chronically stressed. Our list of medications has never been longer here in the United States. And our exposure to pollutants, instead of being constricted to industrial areas, has now affected all of us. And it is coming to even places that we thought they had very fresh air in the past. And again, all those factors are coming along what we now call climate change, which has been going on for several decades as well, but have become a more frequent talk everywhere we go, because now every single person in our planet has been affected somehow by climate change because of the intensity and the frequency of the weather events that we're all experiencing in a regular basis nowadays. So again, this is a very nice picture that summarizes this very complex interaction I was talking about in our road of life, from conception to death. and all the life changes that we go through during our life course, we are constantly being stressed. Our biology is being stressed by, again, changes in what we eat and how we breathe, and what we breathe, changes in our habits in terms of stress and other exposures such as smoking, alcohol, and sleep. And again, our changes in environment, which have been magnified by climate change. And those changes, and again, in interaction with specific genetic backgrounds in individuals, have led to the theories that they lead to chronic inflammation, to eventually autoimmunity in some patients. And in some patients, autoimmunity will develop, will be causing symptoms and signs of autoimmune diseases. And those patients are the ones who seek medical help. And again, unfortunately, for most of autoimmune diseases, treatment can be achieved in terms of alleviating symptoms and helping with improving quality of life. But a lot of times we cannot really reverse course or cure these diseases. And what is climate change? And again, I want to take a step back here just to summarize what we know about climate change. So climate change really refers to the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. And they are secondary to the burning of fossil fuels, things such as gas, oil, and coal. And the burning of fossil fuels causes the emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And if that was at all a question several years ago, what is causing climate change, this is no longer a question nowadays. We know, scientists know, politicians know, we actually know that climate change is caused by the burning of fossil fuels, because there's a very clear proportional relationship in the increase of these greenhouse gases in our atmosphere since the beginning of industrial revolution, when fossil fuel became a source of combustion and energy to our societies. And this green gases, particularly carbon dioxide, which is the most abundant one, have been accumulating out in our atmosphere in parallel to the increase in temperatures. And this increase in temperatures in air and water is what is driving these extreme weather events. And these events have never been as frequent and devastating. I honestly I cannot find a picture to put it here. I decided not to put a picture here in the slide with a devastating situation related to these extreme weather events, because that's too much for me to handle. And I decided to here get a photograph from a satellite about from the Helene hurricane that just hit the Carolinas very recently, and there's one coming for Florida as well, and that is showing just how impressive these hurricanes have become in the most recent years. And not only these extreme weather events have become more frequent and devastating, but what it is happening is that we have been dealing with what we call climate instability. So previous patterns on how our climate behaves in specific times of the year are no longer predictive as they had been in defining what is happening next. So not only our summers have been hotter and our winters have been milder, but also has been difficult to predict when rainfalls happen, droughts happen, so on and so forth. And climate change, again, is not only changing temperatures and causing hurricanes, storms, and droughts to happen more often, but all these factors here that are listed out in this slide, they have been affected directly or indirectly by climate change. So because of climate change, we are seeing increase in infectious diseases, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit. There's good data that climate change and increase in temperature and air pollution has led to more cardiopulmonary and renal complications, water pollution, mental stress, civil unrest. Again, we are expecting, unfortunately, millions and millions of people to be displaced in the next several years because they no longer can live in the places where they used to. And we're already seeing these big displacements of entire communities happening right now. And Climate change has affected our health in many different ways. And in terms of autoimmune diseases, most of the data comes from the impact of air pollution. So, air pollution, when we're talking about air pollution, most of the time what researchers are alluding to, it is the release of the solid particles and gaseous substances in our air, and these are secondary again to fossil fuel combustion. These particles are very complex. We call them, or abbreviate them as PMs, or particulate matters, and they're usually a mix of heavy metals, hydrocarbons, and various gases such as carbon dioxide, ozone, and sulfates and nitrates as well. And these gases are inhaled by us, and the inhalation of these gases is associated with inflammation not only in the lungs, but also these gases and particles are so small that they travel through our bloodstream. And again, there's good data that climate change has increased the exposure to all of from all of us to this particulate matters. And there's data showing that these particulate matters have been associated with an increase in autoimmune diseases. So this is a nice paper from this Italian group from 2022, and I decided to bring this graph just to illustrate the matter. And what they have identified these particular matters, and they divide them according to their size, 2.5 and 10 micrograms per meter square. And they have identified that all-cause autoimmune diseases have increased by 12 and 13%, depending on the particles we're talking about. So again, these particles have been associated with an increase in inflammation, in chronic inflammation, and in the setting of the right genetic framework, they have been linked to the increase in numbers of many kinds of autoimmune diseases, as you can see here in this graph. The other thing that has been directly impacted by climate change is ultraviolet B radiation, or UVB. So the air pollution we are just talking about disrupts what we call the ozone layer. This is a protective layer that is in our stratosphere, and the ozone layer is particularly important to our planet because it filters, again, most of the UVB that is radiating from the sun. As more UVB comes in through our atmosphere and interacts with life here on the planet, diseases that are affected by UVB have been on the rise. Especially diseases such as lupus, dermatomyositis, and Sjogren's have been noticed to be more likely to flare and also more likely to happen. So more diagnosis of these diseases with an increase in UVB exposure. The other thing that I would like to spend some time talking is about the increase in vector-borne and other infectious diseases. So as our climates become, our weather becomes warmer, and areas where specific bugs such as mosquitoes and ticks were not commonly encountered, such as more moderate climates, are now becoming warmer, and the pests and insects are coming to become more frequent in those areas as well. And with them comes their diseases as well. So Lyme disease, Zika, and chikungunya have not only been restricted to specific areas in the Caribbean, North Africa, Asia, and South America, but they have been identified in record numbers in places such as the United States, Europe, or even in Canada. And these diseases have been associated with the development of several immune-mediated diseases as well. And not only these vectors have been found in places that had never been found before and are transmitting specific bacteria and viruses, but we also know that other viruses that circulate with us in a yearly basis, such as influenza, their transmission time has also increased because of changes in the temperature and also because of air pollution. We identified during COVID times that areas that were warmer and more affected by air pollution had demonstrated increased chances of transmission of COVID-19 as well during the high peaks of the pandemic. And these changes in our climate also increases the risk for novel infections. Again, we saw very recently a COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic that happened, and it was really devastating as a new virus went around the world and caused several deaths and several patients to develop long-term complications as well. And we are very concerned that these changes in weather will be associated with more infections coming in the next several years. So as humans and wildlife dislocate because of the climate crisis, they're more likely to again cause transmission of diseases. The melting permafrost, so areas that have been frozen for several hundreds of years, now they're melting down, and there are chances that specific microbes and viruses that have been locked in these frozen areas are going to be unlocked, and they could be causing diseases in the future. And again, habit degradation, animals coming in to interact more often with humans in urban and suburban areas also increase the risk for infections in the future. So another thing that I would like to mention, that it is an important topic as we see patients with autoimmune diseases, is the impact of stress in their risk for flaring, and also in the onset of the diseases. So as a rheumatologist, I try to understand what is behind a new diagnosis or flare of my patients, and more often than not, patients really mention the importance of financial, socioeconomic stress, familiar stress, stresses coming from work as the reason why they flare. And there's plenty of data that our changes in climate, our changes in biodiversity, the terrible news that sometimes we get from the degradation of our environment has had really huge impacts to our mental health. And particularly youth patients seem to be more affected and more vulnerable to these changes in mental health related to our environmental degradation. And there's data showing that, again, psychosocial stress and poor mental health has been associated with increased flares in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, with lupus, with multiple sclerosis, and increased stress not only in an affected patient, but also in their family has been associated with the onset of autoimmune diseases such as type 1 diabetes in young children. And another thing that has been an issue with climate change and will become even more of a conversation in the following years is that different populations are affected differently and disproportionately to climate change. So younger and older age individuals are more affected to climate change. They're more vulnerable to air pollution. They're more vulnerable to also extreme weather events. Folks who have pre-existing medical conditions, of course, have less flexibility when dealing with environmental hazards as well. And individuals who live and work in less privileged areas, they are more susceptible to flooding, droughts, heat waves, are also more affected to climate change related health exposures. And again, this is an important topic for all of us to be acquainted with, which is environmental justice. How we understand our society and how we develop policies to accommodate for the disproportionate need of specific populations. They are disproportionately affected by environmental changes, is something that we all need to be concerned about. And again, what is the role of the rheumatologist? As we are seeing our patients being more affected to autoimmune diseases than ever before, our rheumatologists are really in the front line of teaching the new workforce that is coming to help other patients in the next several years. And we also need to educate our patients on how to mitigate the effects of climate change to their health. And it is part of our role to understand how exactly this climate change related events have affected our immune systems, and also to encourage others in our sector to push for changes in our healthcare, because healthcare accounts for about up to 10% of the greenhouse gases emissions in the United States. And given that there's a lot of room for improvement, so we can decrease our carbon footprint coming from our healthcare. And finally, we need to advocate for better plans, public health policies to mitigate those changes in the future and protect future generations. I want to have a call out here for this wonderful website. So I am part of the Rheumatology Engage in Action for Climate Change, and we have this great website called reactroom.org. And this website has information about not only the activities of rheumatologists engaged in Action for Climate Change, so our group, but also has wonderful education material for patients and providers on how to understand and mitigate health-related consequences due to climate change. Finally, I want to leave here with some final notes that are positive, and also to empower folks that there's a lot to be done and a lot to mitigate in this journey that we'll have together in the next several years that will be crucial for our planetary health. So again, renewable energy has never been affordable as available as it is now. There are new advances in technology that will hopefully allow us to transition off fossil fuels in the near future. And again, it is really important that these conversations become as frequent as possible, and that we continue to educate our neighbors, our family members about it. And again, it is crucial that we push for political change. Finally, last call for, again, our research, as I mentioned before, is our role as rheumatologists to understand how climate change is affecting the life of our patients with autoimmune diseases. And we have a new project called Climate Change and Autoimmune Diseases Survey. And we want to know how these extreme weather events affect patients with autoimmune diseases, if they are more likely to flare or not. And also if their care for their autoimmune diseases is disrupted because of these extreme weather events, and who and from where are the patients most likely to be affected by these extreme weather events. So we really want to know from you. This is going to be a survey that is going to be available in the United States and Canada very soon. And our summit will provide the QR code for the completion of the survey. And we really look forward for your collaboration so we can better understand how climate change has impacted our patients and how to mitigate this in the future. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being with you all today.
Thank you, Dr. Ventura. Changing focus, we now turn to Dr. Veronique Mead, a former family practice physician and Dartmouth-affiliated assistant professor of family medicine and obstetrics. Dr. Mead's talk will take us in a different direction, describing her own journey with chronic illness. Dr. Mead describes some of the connections that can occur between the nervous system, the experience of feeling ill, and the function of different organs in the body. In addition, there is an emerging field of study where investigators are researching the effects of early childhood trauma on an individual's genes. In animal studies, trauma may cause persistent and in some cases even heritable changes in gene expression. Dr. Mead's personal journey with autoimmune disease has led her to study the effects of trauma and how it can contribute to chronic illness, with an emphasis on understanding how to apply trauma resolution methods for patient benefit. Dr. Mead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Veronique Mead, and I'm going to talk with you today about the role of trauma in autoimmune disease. And just to start off, many of you, if not most of you, have probably been told that it's in your head. And I really want to emphasize this is not what I'm talking about today. And I actually really want to provide you with some hard data. So just a little background about myself. I was a family doctor and I taught as an assistant professor at the New Hampshire Dartmouth Family Practice Residency Program. And I ended up changing careers. I really felt that there seemed to be intelligence in symptoms. And I ended up finding out this program called somatic psychology. It's a field I had never heard of before. Most of you probably haven't either. And it was really about learning how to listen to the body. And that's where I first really started learning about trauma. I hadn't learned very much about it in medicine beyond acute care. And it ended up making me really curious whether trauma might be a risk factor for chronic illness. And I've spent the past 25 years looking into the medical research to see if there's any evidence for that. And there's a lot, but it's not been pulled together so much. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about briefly today. And part of what's informed my perspective has also been that I've had a chronic illness myself. I've had chronic fatigue that's been disabling for about the same amount of time, 25 years. And I've also had asthma, started in childhood, and both are doing much better based on the perspectives that I've learned that I'll be sharing with you today. So I want to talk a bit about chronic illness and a perspective of it being kind of like an undersea volcano. And I'm going to share 14 points with you. A lot of it is research, and I'm also going to tell you 2 stories. And the big thing about understanding if trauma resonates with you is that it can offer new tools for your toolkit. So the first piece is that as a doctor, I thought about genes really being the primary and sole cause of chronic diseases. But what we've been learning in the research is that genes may account for about 50% of risk for chronic diseases. And in this particular study, you'll see a lot of the small print on my slides. That's just for anyone who wants to come back to look at the references. But the genes may actually represent only 10 to 30% of risk. And environmental factors like infections, like stress, like trauma or toxins, those may actually be necessary to activate genes and turn them on or off to influence who it is that actually goes on to develop a chronic disease or an autoimmune disease. Point number 2, for most of us, chronic illness starts after some kind of onset trigger, often something that's happened in the months or the year before onset. And this can be an infection, that's fairly common, but it could be something like an accident or the death of a loved one, or all 3, or a lot of other additional factors. And these play a role, but we often think that these are the cause, and then you go and you address it and you try to cure that, and it doesn't cure the illness. There's a whole other body of research in a number of different areas that's been looking at this with a slightly different view. This is where the undersea volcano comes in. And this is a term coined by Charles Poser, who's a physician that was working in the field of multiple sclerosis. And it's sort of that the symptoms, that tip of the volcano that peaks above the ocean, only shows up at the very end, that the disease process has actually been going on for years, if not decades. And part of that came from seeing changes in the brain that preceded the onset of symptoms for a long time. And so what he and colleagues were looking at was, it seems as though the disease process may be initiated in development very early in life and then augmented with other events that happen in childhood. This process is supported by another body of research looking at antibodies and finding that antibodies actually show up 5, 10 years or more before the onset of a disease. This has been seen in research in type 1 diabetes, a lot of different studies showing that, but it's also been seen in rheumatoid arthritis and also in lupus. And this question about antibodies led Dr. Gisela Dahlquist in Sweden to wonder whether there might be pre and perinatal events as risk factors for type 1 diabetes, given that it commonly begins about half the time in childhood. And if antibodies show up for years beforehand, maybe there are risk factors there. So in looking at that, she found that yes, actually events for the mom, such as illness or an injury, something like preeclampsia. It could also be illness or events happening for the baby, being born prematurely, by C-section, or if the baby had respiratory illness. and that all of these could be risk factors. And in looking at this and other studies that colleagues of hers had also done, it wasn't that every baby that's premature develops an autoimmune disease or type 1. And it wasn't that everyone with type 1 was born C-section. And she tried to make sense of this, and pulling it together, she realized they have something in common. And it really seems that there are two things in common. One is that they involve separating mom and baby. And the other is that they're really stressful. And she was basing this on some research, and I'm going to share some of that with you, which is another body of research that looks at the role of prenatal stress. It's known by a number of names. One of them is the fetal origins of adult disease. And this was started in World War II, looking at studies of looking at women who were pregnant during a siege called the Dutch Hunger Winter. And so they experienced both the physical stress of starvation, but also the emotional stress of this life-threatening situation. And what they found was that their babies, when they became adults, had a much higher risk of chronic disease. And these chronic diseases were actually related to diseases of insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, obesity in larger bodies, and also mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. And that these were much more common in the women who had had these experiences of pretty intense prenatal stress. And they've continued these studies and seen that all kinds of different forms of prenatal stress are associated with risk. Part of what's helpful here in relationship to autoimmune disease is that diseases of insulin resistance are actually more common in some autoimmune diseases, which raises the question, are there common origins? So more common insulin resistance in inflammatory bowel disease, in lupus, in MS and psoriasis, also in RA and type 1 diabetes. I want to share an example next with asthma. And asthma is also more common in a number of autoimmune diseases such as type 1 diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, and lupus, again with RA, and also with celiac disease. This common origins idea goes back to what Gisela Dahlquist was wondering as well. So this example of asthma, I learned about this 25 years ago, from a psychologist in California, Tony Madrid. He described working with this 8-year-old with severe asthma. They'd brought her to his practice. He and his colleagues had tried things like visualization and relaxation therapy and family therapy, and nothing worked. But then one day, Chrissy's mother told him something. And she said, "I don't feel love for my daughter. I know I should, but I never have. I feel terrible about it." And it actually gave Tony a clue. And the clue, I'll share a little bit about that background research in a moment. But what he ended up doing was asking Chrissy's mom about the events that had happened for her in the pre and perinatal time frame, pregnancy, labor, birth. And then he treated the mother, Chrissy's mother, for those events using hypnosis or EMDR is what he's done. And since then, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's one way of working with trauma. And I am still shocked by the results of this. What happened was that Chrissy's mother's love returned or came up for the first time, and Chrissy's asthma actually resolved. Treating the mother, asthma in the child resolving. Kind of shocking. I mean, I've just never heard of anything like this in medicine, but he's continued to do this for the past 30 years with similar results. And he's also done a number of small studies showing that the kids who develop asthma have had 3 times more what he calls non-bonding events, these adverse events in the pre and perinatal period that interfere with bonding, as the kids who didn't have asthma. The bonding research comes from 2 pediatricians, John Kennel and Marshall Klaus, who found in the 70s that the Our routine, as we were starting to do hospital births, the routine of separating moms and babies was actually causing problems. And what they saw were differences. The moms were much less actually connecting. Their behaviors were different. Their feelings were different, as for Chrissy's mom. They more often had postpartum depression. And the babies were more often having symptoms like colic, being hard to soothe, more infections, having trouble breastfeeding. I spent 20 years wondering when there'd be research that would show up to explain this. And one of these, there are a lot of studies in this area. There are a number at the bottom of the screen. And these are the newish field around epigenetics, where we're finding that molecules attach to genes to influence how the genes work, to turn them on or off or something in between. And epigenetics are part of how environment, things like life experiences, including prenatal stress, embed in our biology to influence how our genes work. And there's reversibility in this, which is a huge part of what I find encouraging about understanding the role of trauma. The next role of trauma that's been studied, many of you have probably heard of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. These studies, there have been hundreds of studies since the first one in 1998. And ACEs look at 10 specific types of adversity happening before your 18th birthday. The first two, the loss of a parent for any reason, whether it's divorce or death, is an ACE. A parental mental illness. It could be something as simple as postpartum depression, which is something I discovered only as an adult that my mom had experienced for my first 2 years of life. Any kind of abuse, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, is an ACE, as are neglect, physical or emotional neglect. And then these other risks, these other ACEs, if the mother experiences domestic violence, if there's someone who's abusing substances in the household, alcohol or drugs, or if someone goes to jail, these are events that can happen that can make it really difficult, if not impossible, for the child to feel safe. So this is a summary of the ACEs. You get 1 point for each one of these ACEs for a total score of a potential of 10. And when you add up your own score, it gives you some sense of risk for chronic illnesses because of what they've been finding. If you have an ACE score of just 2, which is really common, losing a parent to divorce and postpartum depression would be enough for an ACE score of 2. They found that this greatly increased the risk for any one of the 21 most common autoimmune diseases. And I have a number of surveys on my blog. You'll find a link for this. To do a survey to look at so many other autoimmune diseases that often have not been studied. I would invite you to take these surveys. And if you're someone in good health, I would especially invite you to join us by doing some of these surveys to look at the role of trauma, because that gives us a really helpful comparison for data. ACEs are also associated with an increase in diseases of insulin resistance, like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, lung disease. So there's a gathering of these different kinds of bodies of research looking at different types of adversity in childhood that are really suggesting common origins for what ends up being autoimmune diseases. I want to share one more big study. This was in type 1 diabetes. It was done in Sweden. It's known as the ABIS study, the All Babies in Southeast Sweden. And what they did is they looked at all the babies born in this one community. They asked the parents for permission, and they ended up following 10,000 babies from birth to age 14. And these were babies from the general population. They were not specifically at genetic risk for type 1 diabetes. And what they did is they followed them and they followed their antibodies, and they tracked their risk for type 1 diabetes based on what they called serious life events, SLEs. And they were wondering whether these serious life events, these adverse events, played a role in risk. And they found that, yes, in fact, the children who developed type 1 diabetes by age 14 had 3 times more serious life events than the kids who had not. This was similar to what Tony found with asthma, 3 times more adverse events in the kids with asthma. And so this was a really significant study because they found that these happened, the kids who developed the antibodies at age 1 and at age 2.5 had also all had 3 times more serious life events. So I want to share a story of Ami. Ami is a businesswoman who developed RA in her 40s. It was in her wrists and elbows and shoulders in particular. And she was on the major medications and the anti-inflammatory medications. And she really wondered, is there something that might be going on beyond my having to take meds for the rest of my life? Is there anything I can do? Is there anything I can learn about potential causes of this? And that's where she found my blog, where I've been sharing the research. And the role of trauma was something she really ended up getting very curious about. And she ended up pulling it together, and kind of like this undersea volcano, she looked at her own experiences. And yes, in babyhood, there had been a number of prenatal stressors. And in childhood, she has an ACE score of at least 4, possibly more. And then there were a few events before onset, and she could see how they linked to the kinds of adverse events she'd had in her family growing up. So one of the things that she ended up doing was trauma therapy, working with these different perspectives with her RA, and then looking very specifically at a flare-up that she had right after a date. She'd gone on a date, she'd developed a flare-up, and she paid attention from what she was learning from trauma therapy, listening to the body, being curious about that possibility of intelligence and symptoms. And she felt the sensation in her wrist. And what she realized, to her shock, was that when she felt into it, she realized she wanted to punch a hole in the wall. And what she noticed was that that linked to childhood and having nowhere to express anger in any way that could be seen or heard or felt or responded to. And as an adult, she knew she didn't need to punch a wall. And what she ended up doing was setting a boundary with this guy she'd been on a date with and saying no, because she realized he had a whole number of very subtle clues that he was kind of an abusive person himself. And it reminded her of her childhood. She said no, she didn't date him, and her flare went away. So Ami ended up working with this perspective for a number of years and was able to decrease the frequency and severity of her flare-ups and to decrease her meds. And this is part of the question of what we can do with trauma work. It's really understanding how it embeds in our biology with our gene function. It's how we can look at whether there are events in our lives, including in flares. And I've mentioned the blog surveys before as a way to look at other kinds of trauma that can influence us beyond what I can mention today. And a place to start with this, if this resonates with you at all, you can go to my session profile for handouts, and my speaker profile has links to my blog. There's a handout with books, there's a fact sheet with a lot of reference, and there's places where you can look to find a trauma therapist and directories. And there's also blog posts on my blog about autoimmune disease and trauma, asthma and trauma, and others. So thank you. I hope this is really helpful information. And I have my email for you. You're welcome to email me if you have questions. And take a look at my blog where you can find a lot more additional information.
Thank you for that talk, Dr. Mead. Rounding out the session today will be a presentation from Dr. Brian Anderson, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of the Coalition for Health AI, or CHAI, where he leads a national coalition in the development of technical standards and best practices for governance, testing, evaluation, and monitoring of health AI assurance labs. Dr. Anderson brings his extensive experience in digital health, which has seen an explosion, as we all know, since the pandemic, health standards, and clinical decision support to this important and timely subject. Today, Dr. Anderson will share insights into what we can expect in the future and what his organization is doing to ensure that patients and providers are engaged in the outcomes that benefit everyone. Dr. Anderson.
Well, hello. I'm so happy to be here at the Autoimmune Association's Summit. My name is Brian Anderson. I'm the president and CEO of the Coalition for Health AI. Prior to that, I'm a physician data scientist by training. I've worked with the US government and the private sector in a number of initiatives in the digital health and AI space for the better part of 15, 20 years. Today, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the Coalition for Health AI and some of the incredible work that is happening in our members, amongst our members in CHI, as we like to call ourselves. So I'll go ahead and just briefly introduce you to who we are and what we do. So CHI started 3 years ago in the middle of the pandemic when a number of what I would call non-traditional partners were working together. You had a Google and Amazon and a Microsoft working with a Moderna, a Pfizer, and a Lilly and others, really trying to combat the pandemic. But what we appreciated in that time was working together in a pre-competitive space where you're bringing industry and the government together. Such amazing things can happen. We saw the benefit of that work in the COVID pandemic. We began asking ourselves, is there something more that we can be doing, something we could be doing in the AI space? And so one of the initial questions that we asked was, do we have technically specific definitions about what responsible AI in health looks like? The answer we quickly found was the answer is no, we don't. We have a lot of really great work that's happening in different organizations, different companies, but not in that shared space where we have an agreed upon best practice framework on how to develop AI or how to deploy AI or how to maintain it and monitor it. And so CHI has brought together quite a large coalition, patient community advocates, big technology companies, small technology companies, public sector. I'd mentioned a number of organizations now at the federal and at the state level, medical device manufacturers, payers, and of course, healthcare organizations have all come together under the banner of CHI to do some of this incredible work. Now, this slide is actually even out of date. As of last week, the total member count of CHI is at 4,000. Or over 4,000. So we're really excited bringing together the community of the creators or the developers of AI, the end users or the customers of these models, think organizations like health systems or payers or pharmaceutical companies, and of course, importantly, the patient communities that are, candidly, they are the targets of these models and they are from which the data is used to train these models. So those important three stakeholders are part of CHI to develop these consensus-driven standards or best practice frameworks. Now, we've been busy so far. Earlier this year, we published the Assurance Standards Guide. This is in row 2 there on the slide. The Assurance Standards Guide and the Assurance Standards Checklist for draft comment. This was a body of work that had happened for the past 8 or 9 months. We started it back last year, and it was only in this June that we finally were ready to publish it. But because it is a consensus community-driven effort, it wasn't enough to have it just be done by the 100 people that helped produce it. We opened this up for public feedback to the community. So one takeaway from this presentation certainly is we are looking for your voice to be part of how we finalize these best practice frameworks, these assurance guidance documents in this case. So if you have the chance to take a look at our website, take a look at the content, even if it's just reading the executive summary, giving us some feedback on the standards guide and the checklist would be much appreciated. We're launching a lot of work. This is in that third level there, where we're diving into much deeper technical detail in generative AI and in traditional or predictive AI. We're taking a use case-based approach. In traditional AI, the initial use case is sepsis. In generative AI, the initial use case is ambient listening or AI scribes, as you might have heard it. And in each of those cases, diving into as specific detail as we can to identify specific testing methodologies or metrics to use in evaluating a model, exemplar code or approaches to building models that align with the responsible AI principles is the work that's happening in these working groups. Now, every one of our working groups, what we're doing is we're looking at the AI model according to its life cycle. This diagram that I'm showing you has 6 different stages. You can divide it up in different ways, but it's important when we think about responsible AI and think about clinical decision support for that matter, really to think about it at various important phases. The development phase, of course, is the first, but really importantly also is the deployment and the monitoring phase. Models are only so good as they're used appropriately or they're configured appropriately for a nurse or a physician to use. And certainly you need the kinds of governance committees to monitor these models because performance degrades over time. Drift can enter into the equation and the model performance can significantly be degraded after that. Now, the other big thing that we've been busy on this year in CHI is setting up a network of assurance labs. And you may ask yourself, what is an assurance lab? If you look at any other sector of consequence in the US economy, they have independent entities that evaluate machines, devices, cars, airplanes for safety. Look at the aerospace industry. Look at the automotive industry. I think probably all of us have seen some of those famous car crash test videos where the car races into a wall, the airbags deploy, and then presumably someone's measuring the effects on the car test dummy. We don't have those kinds of labs in health AI. We desperately need to have these kinds of independent entities that can test models for their performance and issue report cards, essentially, transparently for society, for patients in the community, for doctors, to be able to understand how these models perform. Now, we've been doing all this work in a rapidly changing regulatory landscape. Of course, the 2 main entities within Health and Human Services at a federal level that regulate AI include the Office of the National Coordinator, now the Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy, ASTP, and the FDA. The Office of Civil Rights, importantly, also plays a role now in its clarification of Rule 1557 on algorithms that are discriminatory. OCR will have a position and will have a regulatory space to help correct those kinds of models. So you have, I think, an opportunity in this space for assurance labs to be able to help drive some of the regulatory considerations, like the FDA's. Are these models safe and effective? Like OCRs, are these models discriminatory? Or like ONCs, are these models being, is data being shared in a transparent way about how these models perform? Because providers are on the hook for things like discriminatory models. And so you want to make sure that providers understand how these models were built, how these AI models were trained. And so these model cards that ONC has proposed is really an important consideration. And it's something that we've really been focused on within CHI. Patient community advocates have been part of this work. If you think of a soup can or you're going to your grocery store, everyone is familiar with nutrition labels. It's a snapshot of the content in whatever the thing is that you're going to buy. Model cards for AI are very similar. CHI is taking an approach to develop a model card or a nutrition label for AI that patients can understand, that physicians and nurses can understand. It's not going to be the 30-page evaluation report that comes out of the assurance lab. It's really, if you imagine, again, like a little note card or a nutrition label on a can, that kind of content that would enable a patient to be able to understand, do I even want this model to be used on me? Or a provider to be able to understand, should I use this AI model on the patient I have in front of me? We're really excited about that work. We're going to be sharing more about that in October. And again, similar to the Assurance Standards Guide, really inviting people's feedback on the first draft version of that. Let me close by saying we urgently need to think about how to make sure that AI models, particularly in the generative AI space, are aligned to our values, to how we think about health, be it physical health, emotional health, mental health, spiritual health, health of a community. The kinds of capabilities that generative AI are demonstrating now and will only continue to demonstrate more emergent capabilities over the next 2 to 5 years are going to likely create scenarios where AI tools are ubiquitous, where patients use them all the time. to help navigate complex healthcare delivery systems, understanding what the next best treatment state is for a complex disease. Ensuring that these models are aligned to your individual understanding of what your values are and your priorities are is a critical area that no one is addressing yet, from my perspective. This is a space where in CHAI, we're going to potentially be prioritizing this over the next few months to begin pulling together a community of stakeholders that is more than just the technology experts at these companies, but really truly includes members of communities with lived disease experience, leaders from communities, be them spiritual or community or otherwise, to begin help us to understand how we create a framework for evaluation for society as it relates to health to ensure that these models are aligned to our concept of human flourishing or human priorities and human values. So that's some of the upcoming work that we're excited to engage in CHAI. Welcome your participation from the Autoimmune Association. It's a really exciting time as we think about the power of AI and the road ahead of us and what that means for empowering the individuals that are patients that are in our society that could use these tools. The challenge is, of course, ensuring that these models are aligned with their individual values, their individual priorities for their own health. So if you're interested in any of this, all of this, please consider joining us. And I look forward to hearing more about the outcomes and impact of the Autoimmune Association's Community Summit. So thanks so much for having me. I'll send it back to the host.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for your insights. Today's discussions have highlighted some groundbreaking research in autoimmune disease, offering exciting possibilities for better diagnoses, new avenues of treatment, and potential cures. As we move forward, the research and insights. Sorry. All right, let's try this again. It's getting increasingly awkward. All right. Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for your insights. Today's discussions have highlighted some groundbreaking research in autoimmune disease, offering exciting possibilities for better diagnoses, new avenues of treatment, and potential cures. As we move forward, the research and insights that we've heard about today and other work that is being conducted at centers all over the world are bringing us closer to transforming patient care and improving lives. Indeed, the future is bright for the autoimmune community. I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.